Is it better to have a leader who tells beautiful lies that make you feel good, or one who tells harsh truths that help you survive? Most people claim they want honesty, but their actions tell a very different story. Just look at Elizabeth Holmes. Her technology never worked, but her story was irresistible. Investors, employees, and even patients ignored countless warning signs because they wanted to believe in a miracle. She embodied the charismatic leader we crave, passionate, visionary, promising to save millions of lives, and so they trusted her, right up until the lie unraveled and destroyed fortunes, careers, and even patient health. Meanwhile, psychological research from Harvard's Amy Edmondson shows that the most effective leaders often score lower on traditional charisma. Instead, they're the ones creating what she calls psychological safety. They ask uncomfortable questions, admit uncertainty, and prepare for failure. They're not particularly inspiring in the moment, but they build lasting success. This contradiction between what we want in leaders and what actually works would have made perfect sense to Niccolò Machiavelli, a 16th century Italian philosopher who spent his life studying why kingdoms rise and fall. Today, we're going to explore how this supposedly evil thinker understood leadership better than anyone before or since, and why nearly everything he warned us about is playing out in today's world. Machiavelli wrote something that still makes people uncomfortable today. Since it is difficult to join virtue and power together, it is much safer to be feared than to be loved. But here's what he actually meant, and why modern psychology proves he was right. First, let's clarify what Machiavelli meant by feared. He wasn't advocating for cruelty or intimidation. He was talking about respect born from competence and accountability. The kind of fear you feel when you know your leader will make the hard decisions that need to be made, even if they're unpopular. It's the difference between being afraid of someone and being afraid to disappoint them. Machiavelli wasn't advocating for tyranny. He was observing that leaders who prioritize being liked over being effective often create more suffering in the long run. He'd seen it happen over and over. Charming rulers who made popular decisions that led to economic collapse, military defeat, and social chaos. Think about this in business terms. Research by Harvard Business School's Francesca Gino found that leaders who consistently avoid difficult conversations and unpopular decisions to maintain their likability actually create more workplace stress and lower performance. Their teams suffer from what psychologists call chronic uncertainty because problems never get addressed directly. Consider the 2008 financial crisis. Many of the bank executives involved were genuinely well-liked by their employees and communities. They were charitable, personable, and inspiring. But their desire to keep everyone happy led them to avoid acknowledging risks, confronting poor performers, and making the hard decisions that could have prevented catastrophe. Machiavelli understood something that modern research confirms. Respect and fear aren't opposites of love. They're alternatives to it. And when you're responsible for other people's welfare, being respected is more valuable than being loved because respect creates boundaries, accountability, and clear expectations. This doesn't mean effective leaders are heartless. It means they understand that temporary discomfort often prevents permanent damage. They're willing to have the difficult conversation now to avoid the crisis later. Here's where Machiavelli gets really controversial. He argued that the ends justify the means, but not in the way most people think. He wrote, "In the actions of men, and especially of leaders, when there is no court of appeal, one judges by the result." This isn't about doing evil for good outcomes. It's about recognizing that leadership requires moral complexity that simple rules can't capture. Sometimes the most ethical choice looks unethical in the moment. Psychological research supports this uncomfortable truth. Studies by Harvard's Joshua Green show that people who make better long-term decisions often score higher on measures of cognitive flexibility and lower on measures of moral certainty. They're more willing to consider context, weigh competing values, and accept responsibility for imperfect choices. Take the example of Steve Jobs returning to Apple in 1997. He immediately fired thousands of employees, canceled dozens of projects, and made decisions that seemed ruthless to outside observers. Critics called him heartless and controlling, but his actions saved the company and ultimately created more jobs and innovation than if he'd tried to preserve everyone's feelings in the short term. Machiavelli would have understood this perfectly. He knew that leaders who are unwilling to make difficult decisions don't avoid causing harm, they just delay it and make it worse. The executive who refuses to fire an underperforming manager might seem kind, but they're actually allowing that manager to damage their entire team's morale and productivity. This is what psychologists call the moral licensing effect. When we focus too much on appearing virtuous, we sometimes neglect the actual consequences of our actions. We feel good about our intentions while ignoring the results. Machiavelli observed something that seems contradictory. A leader who is always compassionate will be destroyed by those who are not. But he also wrote, "Cruelty well used may be called mercy." What did he mean by this apparent contradiction? He was describing what modern psychology calls strategic empathy, the ability to understand others' perspectives, not just to be kind, but to be effective. True empathy sometimes requires actions that feel harsh in the moment, but prevent greater suffering later. Research by Stanford's Jamil Zaki demonstrates that cognitive empathy, understanding how others think and feel, is more useful for leadership than emotional empathy, feeling what others feel. Leaders who get too emotionally involved in every decision often make choices that feel good, but create worse outcomes. Consider the example of a CEO who discovers that one of their factories is polluting a local water supply. The emotionally empathetic response might be to gradually reduce pollution to avoid immediate job losses. The strategically empathetic response might be to shut down the factory immediately, even though it causes short-term hardship because it prevents long-term health disasters. But let's also look beyond the corporate world. Consider Winston Churchill's leadership during World War II. In 1940, he made the agonizing decision to keep Britain in the fight, even when defeat seemed almost certain, rather than pursuing peace talks that might have temporarily spared lives. Many in his war cabinet and much of the public hoped to negotiate. The popular choice would have been to seek a settlement. Instead, Churchill chose a path that led to years of bombing, rationing, and immense sacrifice, because he understood that compromising with tyranny would bring far greater suffering in the long run. He was willing to be temporarily despised to prevent permanent catastrophe. Machiavelli understood that real compassion often requires the strength to disappoint people in the short term. He'd seen too many leaders who tried to make everyone happy and ended up destroying everything they were trying to protect. This connects to what psychologists call temporal discounting, our tendency to value immediate rewards over long-term benefits. Effective leaders have to resist this tendency not just in themselves, but in their organizations. They have to be willing to be temporarily unpopular to create lasting value. Here's where Machiavelli's insights become truly chilling. He wrote, "Men are so simple and ready to obey present necessities that one who deceives will always find those who allow themselves to be deceived." He wasn't celebrating this fact, he was warning us about it. This dynamic manifests constantly. Employees following questionable orders from confident bosses, citizens rallying behind leaders offering simplistic solutions to complex problems. We see small versions of this everywhere. Modern psychology has confirmed Machiavelli's observations in disturbing detail. Stanley Milgram's famous obedience experiments show that ordinary people will follow harmful orders from authority figures. Philip Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment demonstrated how quickly power corrupts both leaders and followers. Research reveals an even more troubling layer. Studies by Adam Galinsky at Columbia show that power doesn't just corrupt leaders, It makes them less capable of accurate judgment. Powerful people literally lose the ability to understand how their actions affect others. They become more impulsive, less empathetic, and more likely to take risks that hurt their organizations. This is why Machiavelli was so focused on systems and structures, not just individual character. He understood that good people in bad systems will often do bad things, while bad people in good systems can be constrained to do good things. Think about how many corporate scandals involve executives who started with good intentions. They gradually made small compromises, surrounded themselves with yes people, and lost touch with reality. Each individual decision seemed reasonable, but the cumulative effect was catastrophic. Or consider the non-profit sector, where leaders often face impossible choices between mission and sustainability. Take the example of a humanitarian organization leader who discovers that 30% of their donations are being diverted by corrupt local officials. The popular choice might be to continue operations to help the 70% who benefit, keeping donors happy and maintaining the organization's reputation. The harder choice is to suspend operations entirely, disappoint donors, and face criticism while building new systems that ensure aid reaches those who need it most. Machiavelli's solution was radical transparency about power's corrupting influence. He believed that leaders needed to actively seek out criticism, surround themselves with people who would challenge them, and create systems that would constrain their own worst impulses. Perhaps Machiavelli's most misunderstood insight was this: fortune is the judge of half our actions, but she allows us to govern the other half. He wasn't promoting reckless gambling. He was advocating for strategic risk-taking based on careful analysis. Modern behavioral economics has validated this approach. Research by Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman shows that most people are terrible at assessing risk because they're driven by emotion rather than data. They avoid small risks that could lead to big rewards, while taking big risks that could lead to catastrophic losses. Effective leaders do the opposite. They take calculated risks that others avoid, while being extremely cautious about decisions that could destroy everything they've built. They understand that avoiding all risk is actually the riskiest strategy of all. Consider how Jeff Bezos built Amazon. He consistently made decisions that seemed risky to outsiders, reinvesting profits instead of paying shareholders, expanding into new markets, prioritizing long-term growth over short-term gains. But each decision was based on careful analysis of what could go wrong and what the potential rewards were. Machiavelli would have appreciated this approach. He understood that leaders who try to avoid all risk end up being overtaken by those who take smart risks. The key is distinguishing between necessary risks that advance your goals and unnecessary risks that just feed your ego. Here's where Machiavelli's philosophy becomes deeply personal. He wrote, "Since love and fear can hardly exist together, if we must choose between them, it is far safer to be feared than loved." This wasn't cynicism. It was the painful wisdom of someone who'd seen idealistic leaders destroy everything they touched. This section revealed something darker than the illusion of virtue. How the relentless pursuit of being universally loved gradually erodes a leader's ability to maintain any standards at all. The personal cost to leaders who can't accept being disliked is that they become paralyzed by the need for approval, unable to make necessary decisions, even when they know what's right. Psychological research confirms that leaders who are driven primarily by the need to be liked often create more problems than they solve. According to research by Jennifer Chapman at UC Berkeley's Haas School of Business, those leaders often avoid necessary conflicts, fail to hold people accountable, and create environments where problems just fester instead of being solved. The tragedy is that these leaders often have the best intentions. They genuinely want to help people and create positive change. But their inability to accept that leadership sometimes requires difficult decisions makes them ineffective and ultimately harmful. Over time, their organizations develop what psychologists call learned helplessness, a culture where problems are tolerated because everyone knows the leader won't address them. Think about managers who won't give honest feedback because they don't want to hurt feelings. They think they're being kind, but they're actually preventing their employees from growing and improving. They're prioritizing their own comfort over their team's development. Eventually, high performers leave for environments with clearer expectations, while low performers stay because they know they'll never be challenged. Machiavelli understood that effective leadership requires what psychologists call moral courage, the willingness to do the right thing, even when it's personally costly. This often means accepting that some people will genuinely dislike you for doing your job well, and that this dislike might be permanent. But here's the crucial question. If Machiavellian wisdom is so valuable, how do we prevent it from becoming manipulation? How do we ensure that leaders who embrace tough decisions don't become tyrants? Machiavelli himself provided the answer. Where the willingness is great, the difficulties cannot be great. He understood that preventing abuse requires intentional systems, not just good intentions. Modern psychology confirms this approach. Research by Harvard's Amy Edmondson shows that the environments she terms psychologically safe, where people can speak up without being punished, are crucial for preventing abuses of power, building on Edmondson's foundational work on psychological safety. Leaders who embrace Machiavellian wisdom must actively cultivate dissent and reward people who challenge their decisions. Consider Frances Hesselbein, who transformed the Girl Scouts through decades of systematic work. She made countless unpopular decisions, restructuring operations, confronting difficult realities, enforcing new standards. But she also built what she called leadership at every level, creating systems where anyone could challenge decisions and propose alternatives. She understood that true strength comes from building robust institutions, not concentrating power. The key difference is accountability. True Machiavellian leadership accepts responsibility for outcomes, while manipulation tries to avoid consequences. When a leader says, "This decision will be unpopular, but here's why it's necessary," they're using wisdom. When they say, "Trust me, I know what's best," they're sliding into manipulation. Personal safeguards matter too. Leaders who regularly question their own motivations, seek feedback from people who disagree with them, and maintain relationships outside their power structure are less likely to be corrupted by their position. The moment you start believing that your tough decisions are always right, you've stopped being a leader and started being a dictator. It's also worth noting that these principles apply differently depending on your leadership context. In purely collaborative environments, research teams, creative partnerships, volunteer organizations, the social dynamics are different than in hierarchical structures with clear authority lines. But even in collaborative contexts, someone usually needs to make final decisions when consensus can't be reached. The principles remain the same. Prioritize outcomes over comfort, accept responsibility for difficult decisions, and be willing to disappoint people in the short term to serve them in the long term. In collaborative environments, Machiavellian wisdom might look like the researcher who insists on rigorous peer review even when it delays publication, or the volunteer coordinator who enforces standards even when it means losing popular but unreliable volunteers. So why does any of this matter today? Because we're living through a leadership crisis that Machiavelli predicted with stunning accuracy. We're surrounded by leaders who prioritize appearance over substance, who tell us what we want to hear instead of what we need to know, and who avoid difficult decisions until they become impossible to ignore. Research by the Center for Creative Leadership shows that 75% of executives believe their leadership development programs focus too much on inspirational qualities and not enough on practical decision-making skills. They're being trained to be likable rather than effective. Meanwhile, our most pressing problems, climate change, economic inequality, technological disruption, require exactly the kind of leadership Machiavelli described. They require people who can make difficult decisions, communicate uncomfortable truths, and prioritize long-term outcomes over short-term popularity. The leaders who will succeed in the coming decades won't be the ones who make us feel good about ourselves. They'll be the ones who help us confront reality, make necessary changes, and build sustainable systems. They'll be the ones who understand that true leadership isn't about being loved, it's about being useful. But here's the uncomfortable truth that Machiavelli forces us to confront. The qualities that make someone appealing as a leader are often different from the qualities that make them effective as a leader. Charisma, optimism, and agreeableness are wonderful traits in friends and family members. But in leaders, they can be dangerous if they're not balanced by pragmatism, realism, and the courage to make unpopular decisions. Research by Jim Collins in his book Good to Great found that the most successful leaders often had what he called professional will, an unwavering commitment to doing whatever it takes to make their organizations successful, even if it meant making personally difficult decisions. These leaders understood something that Machiavelli knew intuitively, that leadership is ultimately about serving something larger than yourself. And sometimes serving that larger purpose requires actions that feel harsh or unpopular in the moment. So, how do we apply Machiavelli's insights without becoming cynical or manipulative ourselves? The answer lies in understanding what Machiavelli really meant when he said, "Everyone sees what you appear to be, few experience what you really are." He wasn't advocating for deception. He was pointing out that leadership requires managing perceptions while staying true to your deeper purpose. We need leaders who can evaluate decisions not just by how they make people feel, but by what results they actually produce. Instead of asking, "Do I like their message?" we should ask, "Are they telling me what I need to hear?" Instead of, "How does this person make me feel?" We should ask, "What outcomes do they deliver?" This means developing what psychologists call integrative complexity, the ability to consider multiple perspectives, tolerate uncertainty, and make decisions with incomplete information. It means being willing to disappoint people in the short term to serve them in the long term. Most importantly, it means accepting that leadership is not about being perfect, it's about being useful. As Machiavelli wrote, "Since it is difficult to join virtue and power together, effective leaders focus on making the best decisions they can with the information they have, accepting responsibility for the consequences, and learning from their mistakes." The path forward requires embracing what Machiavelli understood, that leadership is ultimately about serving something larger than yourself. And sometimes serving that larger purpose requires actions that feel harsh or unpopular in the moment. Machiavelli wasn't evil. He was just honest about how the world works. He knew that leadership means juggling conflicting values, making tough calls with incomplete information, and carrying the weight of decisions that shape other people's lives. He warned us that the road to hell is often paved with good intentions, and that the most dangerous leaders are usually the ones who believe their own propaganda. His ideas still matter because human nature hasn't changed. We still crave approval, shy away from hard conversations, and choose comforting lies over uncomfortable truths. But today the stakes are far greater. The choices our leaders make will decide if we can tackle climate change, handle rapid technological shifts, and build a future that lasts. We need leaders who understand that true power doesn't come from being feared or loved, but from being trusted to make the hard decisions for something bigger than themselves. Leaders who balance idealism with pragmatism, compassion with accountability, and hope with realism. Machiavelli's real insight wasn't that leaders should be ruthless, it was that they should be honest about what leadership truly demands. It's not about being perfect or keeping everyone happy, it's about doing what needs to be done. Remember that dilemma we started with? The choice between leaders who tell pretty lies to make you feel good, and those who tell hard truths that help you survive. Machiavelli was clear. In the long run, harsh truths protect you better than sweet illusions. The leader who tells you what you want to hear may win your heart, but the one who tells you what you need to hear might just save your life. So the real question isn't whether you agree with Machiavelli. It's whether you're ready to face the hard truths he uncovered about power, human nature, and the cost of real leadership. Will you choose substance over style, results over empty promises, and hard truths over pretty lies? If this look at leadership through Machiavelli's eyes made you think differently, hit like and tell me in the comments what part of his philosophy struck you most. And if you think others need to hear these uncomfortable truths, share this video with them. After all, the conversations we avoid are often the ones we need most.